Gustave Le Bon was a French social psychologist and sociologist, best known for his work on group psychology, most notably what he called the psychology of the crowd. Le Bon argued that within a group, an individual's sense of humanity becomes diluted, the ability to think independently is lost, and the spirit of the group replaces the spirit of the individual. He is most widely known for the psychology of peoples and masses. At the time, the book was highly regarded. Edward Bernays, the marketing genius of the last century, for example, drew many ideas from it. The practical application of those ideas is quite fascinating, and I may make a separate video about that someday, but that is not our focus here. The book is still remembered and read today. However, I would like to draw attention to another work by Le Bon that, for some reason, has remained largely unknown, The Psychology of Socialism. In it, Le Bon offers a careful analysis of why socialism is psychologically appealing to the masses, how it gradually came to replace religion as the latter lost its influence, and he even made a number of surprisingly accurate predictions about the future. All of this is particularly striking given that the book was written at the end of the 19th century, long before the real-world consequences of implementing socialism, as seen in the USSR, had become apparent. I strongly recommend this book to anyone who considers themselves a classical liberal and rejects totalitarian socialism. Despite being more than 100 years old, it remains relevant in many respects and has unquestionably aged better than the works of Karl Marx, written a few decades earlier. Le Bon also addressed Marx's errors that were already visible at the time. Below is a rough translation of a short excerpt from the book to give you a feel for what it's about. Everything that has created the greatness of civilizations, science, art, philosophical systems, religions, military power, and so on, has been the work of individuals, not of social organizations. The most important discoveries and cultural achievements from which all of humanity benefits were produced by exceptional people, rare and superior products of some of the most gifted nations. Nations in which individualism is most highly developed, stand at the forefront of civilization and dominate the world precisely for this reason. For centuries, that is, for many years preceding our own age, social organization, at least among the Latin peoples, was all-powerful. The individual outside it was nothing. The revolution, the culmination of all the doctrines of 18th-century thinkers, was perhaps the first serious attempt at a reaction in favor of individualism, but while it freed the individual, at least in theory, it also isolated him from his caste, his family, and the social or religious groups to which he belonged, leaving him to himself alone, and thus replacing society with a collection of disconnected individuals, lacking any real bonds between them. Such an arrangement could not endure for long among peoples who, by their inherited traits, institutions, and education, were poorly suited to relying solely on their own strength and governing themselves without leaders. These peoples eagerly demand equality but take little interest in freedom. Freedom is competition, an unceasing struggle, the mother of all progress. Only the most capable and the strongest can prevail in it, while the weak, as in nature generally, are condemned to perish. Only the strong can endure solitude and rely exclusively on themselves. The weak cannot. They will sooner accept the harshest form of servitude than isolation and the absence of support. The corporations and castes destroyed by the revolution had provided individuals with their primary support in life, and it is evident that they corresponded to a psychological necessity, since today they are re-emerging everywhere under new names, especially in the form of trade unions. These unions allow their members to reduce their individual effort to a minimum, whereas individualism demands the opposite. Left to himself, the proletarian is nothing, and can accomplish nothing. United with his equals, he becomes a formidable force. Even if the union cannot give him intelligence or ability, it at least grants him strength, taking away only a freedom he would not have known how to use in any case. The development of individualism inevitably leads to the individual finding himself alone, amid a fierce struggle of competing appetites. Young, vigorous nations, among whom there are not great differences in individual intellectual capacity, such as the Anglo-Saxons, for example, adapt easily to such a state of affairs. Through associations, English and American workers have learned how to resist the demands of capital and do not submit to its tyranny. In this way, every interest has managed to secure its place. But among old nations, in which initiative has been weakened over centuries and through systems of education, the consequences of the development of individualism have been extremely severe. The philosophers of the previous century and the Revolution, in definitively destroying all religious and social bonds, the church, the family, castes, and corporations, that sustained human existence and provided it with a stable foundation, believed they were creating something supremely democratic. In reality, this destruction unexpectedly gave rise to a financial aristocracy, whose overwhelming power now reigns over a mass of defenseless, atomized individuals. The feudal lord did not treat his retainers as harshly as the modern industrial magnate, the king of factories and mills, sometimes treats his workers. In theory, these workers enjoy all freedoms and are equal before the law to their employer. In practice, they feel the heavy chains of dependence hanging over them, at least in the form of constant threat, along with the ever-present fear of poverty. The urge to correct these unforeseen consequences of the revolution was bound to arise, and the opponents of individualism had no shortage of serious arguments to wield against it. It was easy for them to claim that the social organism is more important than the individual, that the interests of the latter must yield to those of the former, that the less capable and the weak have a right to support, and that society itself must, through a new redistribution of wealth, eliminate the inequalities created by nature. Thus modern socialism came into being, the offspring of ancient socialism, seeking, like its predecessor, to alter the distribution of wealth, by impoverishing the rich for the benefit of the poor. In theory, the means of eliminating inequality are extremely simple. The state need only take the distribution of property into its own hands, and continually restore the balance whenever it tilts in favor of the wealthy. From this idea, hardly new, yet highly seductive in appearance, arose the tenets of socialist thought. Socialist doctrines differ greatly in their details, but in their fundamental principles they are remarkably similar. Their common core is collectivism. We shall say a few words about its origins when examining socialism in Germany. At present, socialism has split into many schools, but all share the same general tendency, to appeal to state guardianship, entrusting it with the task of distributing wealth and smoothing out the injustices of fate. The central proposals of the socialists are, at least on the surface, strikingly simple. The state confiscates capital, mines, and property, administers these nationalized assets, and redistributes them among citizens through a vast army of officials. The state, or, if one prefers, the community, would regulate everything. Competition would not be permitted. Even the faintest expressions of initiative, individual freedom, or competition would be suppressed. The country would be transformed into an immense monastery, subject to a harsh discipline enforced by an army of bureaucrats. Since inheritance of property would be abolished, the accumulation of wealth in a few hands could no longer occur. As for individual needs, collectivism takes into account almost nothing beyond the necessity of food, and concerns itself primarily with that alone. It is obvious that such a system of regulating the distribution of wealth would amount to an absolute dictatorship of the state, or, what is essentially the same, of the community, and to no less absolute a form of servitude for the workers. Yet this argument would scarcely affect them. They are little concerned with freedom, as evidenced by the enthusiasm with which they once welcomed the rise of the Caesars. Nor are they greatly troubled by what constitutes the greatness of civilization, art, science, literature, and the like, all of which would quickly disappear in such a society. The collectivist program therefore contains nothing that would appear repugnant to them. In exchange for the subsistence promised by socialist theorists, the workers would perform their labor under the supervision of state officials, much as convicts once did in penal colonies under the watchful eye and constant threat of the overseer. All personal initiative would be stifled, and every worker would rest, sleep, and eat at the command of supervisors assigned to oversee security, food, labor, rest, and absolute equality among all. There would be no incentive to improve one's condition or to rise above it. This would be the darkest form of slavery, without any hope of liberation. Under the rule of a capitalist, a worker can at least dream of becoming a capitalist himself, and this does sometimes happen. But what is he to dream of under the yoke of an anonymous, inescapable, despotic tyranny of the equalizing state, which anticipates all the needs of its citizens and governs all their desires? Bordeaux argues that such an organization would closely resemble that of the Jesuits in Paraguay. Might it not resemble even more closely the organization of slaves on plantations in the age of slavery?